Now, I'm going to jump to the third paradigm, the one that is presented in 1924, because I think that these two paradigms, while they are distinct, they correspond on many levels. I would say that we can call them structural paradigms. So these are ways that Freud builds his meta-psychology as a form of structuralism. Now, the third paradigm, and I'll briefly present it today, it builds on the first paradigm, also on the second one, but mostly on the first one. And this is where Freud actually introduces his structural model into what he has developed in terms of the psychoneuroses. So those of you that might need a quick reminder, the structural model is the one that involves the ego, the id, and the superego. The topological model has to do with the conscious, preconscious, unconscious system. So what we see here is a development of Freud's notion of rejection, this time appearing under the guise of disavowal. Now, disavowal is a very interesting term in Freud because it appears several times in his teaching and in very different contexts. So I would say that it appears in relation to psychosis in these papers, but it also appears in relation to perversion, another structure of subjectivity, in some other papers. But let's stick with this one. So what we see here in 1924 is that Freud rearticulates what we talked about in terms of rejection of reality, in terms of the ego and the id. And he says that in neurosis, what we see is a conflict between the ego and the id, whereas repression, what it does is it represses a piece of the id. And he says, in comparison, in psychosis, we see a conflict between the ego and reality. And what happens is that the subject withdraws or disavows a piece of reality. So again, neurosis, conflict between ego and id; psychosis, conflict between ego and reality. Again, this term reality, this problematic term that we can read in several ways. Now, what is interesting in this paradigm is that Freud becomes more explicit in his distinction between two stages in the, let's say, onset or structuration of psychosis. First stage is a stage that we can say a stage that is a negative stage, where a conflictual impulse is excluded or eradicated from the psyche. And then there is the second stage, which we can characterize as being affirmative. This is a stage where we see a compensation for that portion of reality that was damaged. And what is interesting here is that Freud says that neurosis and psychosis share the second stage, but they differ on the first stage. And here I'll paste a quote for all of you, and I'll read it out loud. Neurosis, it's just, I always say, well, you don't believe me, you can read it in Freud, so here we go. Neurosis and psychosis differ from each other far more in their first introductory reaction than in the attempt at reparation which follows it. So this is very interesting. And for some of you, it might sound even anti-intuitive. What we see here is Freud concentrating on this first introductory aspect of psychosis. We can say that the second one is what we know as symptom formation. Freud says that these symptoms are oriented at restoring something that was excluded because it was conflictual. I will give a much more elaborate description of this when we go back to the case of Schreber in a few minutes. Why is this argument so anti-intuitive? because today, especially if we abide by the psychiatric framework, we'll usually distinguish psychosis by the vast delusional world that is constructed, and also we'll identify it by these elementary phenomenon that we usually see, like hallucinations. So we would usually diagnose psychosis based on this second aspect, this second part that Freud talks about. But what we see here is that Freud implies that while these might be more easily distinguished behaviorally, right? So we can see them, we can have a list next to us and sort of say, okay, patient doesn't know what year it is, patient is hearing voices, check, etc. But Freud says that these are not sufficient in the distinction of psychosis. This is groundbreaking, I think, Freud saying that, and also insisting that these symptoms are only secondary to what can truly be characterized as the singular nature of psychosis. So basically what we see here is Freud claiming that both in neurosis and in psychosis, that this second compensatory stage entails some attempt to preserve or compensate for what was excluded. And this compensation comes in the form of a compromise in what we might call a symptom. Now, in both cases, this compromise is only partially successful in substituting or solving whatever happened due to the repression or rejection of this impulse that had a very deep effect on the subject's reality. Now, in neurosis, the conflictual piece of reality, Freud says, is substituted by the world of fantasy, right? That is separated from the external world. And in psychosis, and this is very interesting to see here in Freud's engagement with psychosis at this time in his teaching, Freud says that in psychosis, this world of fantasy also takes center stage because it is the storehouse from which the materials or the patterns for building the new reality are derived. So this is very interesting, the fact that Freud talks about delusions and the world of fantasy taking center stage in psychosis as something that is compensatory, important, and even productive. I will get much more into that very soon when we talk about the case of Schreber.